Wales, 1883. In the narrow upper margin of a faded parish census tucked among the damp and curling ledgers of Landalow's vestry hall, a single listing appears, one parcel marked as inhabited. No names, no ages, just a single stroke of ink pressed harder than the rest, as if the scribe paused, considered, and then quietly continued. The same property had appeared in 3 consecutive census cycles. Each time it was described the same way: dwelling intact, chimneys, warm curtains drawn. But no voices answered. No children ever walked to school bearing the family name. What remains of them wasn't found in photographs or deeds or even grave markers. It was hidden decades later behind a false wall in the kitchen. A narrow room, stone-lined and dark with graphite. Its surface carved not with symbols or language, but with dates. Hundreds of them repeated in paired sequences, spiraling across the walls in uneven arcs as though they were mapped around something that once stood at the center. A few dates matched official census years. Others didn't match anything at all. One, carved deeper than the rest, matched the day the original inspector disappeared. There was no furniture, no tools, no clothing. But beneath the hearthstone, a note was discovered folded, preserved in animal fat. It was unsigned. Inside were 5 names, the same 5 that appear in school rosters, burial logs, and baptismal ledgers, again and again across 60 years. Always the same, never aging, never dying. And now, you found it too. You're reading their page. So, tell me, what time is it? Where you are? And where in the world are you watching from? There's something oddly comforting about that, isn't there? Knowing we're scattered across the world, yet sitting quietly on the same page together. If you're still with me, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe to the 7th mark. There are more pages waiting. In the spring of 1883, census ledgers from Carmarthen arrived at the capital 3 days late. Not due to weather, not due to mechanical failure. The delay came from a single missing entry. The agent responsible for the southwestern quadrant, Mr. Ellis Gillam, had submitted all required records except one, Lot 42, Gwyneffer. 4 acres of rocky pastureland resting against the northern escarpment. It had been surveyed repeatedly and listed as occupied since 1810. The structures were always noted as maintained. Taxes were unpaid, but not delinquent. Still, for the 3rd census in a row, the column marked household members was left untouched. Where names should have appeared, there was only one deliberate stroke of ink. Horizontal, not crossed out, no annotation, no initials. The property sat about 3 miles east of the village of Kundu, on a slope long referred to by locals as Kisgod Yedau, the shadow of graves. The name didn't come from a cemetery, no headstones nearby, no ruined chapel, no crumbling crypt. But the name remained passed from mouth to mouth through generations, each telling stranger than the last. Mr. Gillam had travelled there alone. His field note, what little survives, reads: April 6, 1883. Reached parcel 42 by foot, dwelling intact. 2 chimneys. Smoke observed in western flue. No dogs. Knocked twice. No reply. Curtains drawn. No signage. No crest. Movement behind curtain. Shape unclear. Did not engage further. Marked as present uncooperative. That was all. The rest of the page had been torn deliberately. What happened after was never referenced in any formal correspondence. but a handwritten footnote on the back of the field log, unsigned, reads, "Property appears responsive to intrusion. No human sound. Chimney warmth confirmed. No livestock visible. Windows absorb more light than they reflect." The handwriting did not belong to Mr. Gillum. In a rare break from protocol, the census office contacted the Kamadan Chavivestri, directly requesting any parish records about the occupants of the Gwynnefa parcel. The chapel warden returned a brief reply. "The house has always belonged to the Reline. But we have no christening, no burial, no banns, no witness records bearing their name." An internal review considered assigning a second agent to the site. The recommendation was crossed out with a handwritten note. "No legal grounds to investigate. Absence is not obstruction." In the years that followed, census takers passing through the region were quietly instructed by superiors mark as present, unverified. No further inquiry required. The entry was always the same, horizontal, unbroken, pressed at a constant angle. The ink darker than anything else on the page. Yet, in the 1883 census ledger preserved at the National Archive, the Gwyn record has vanished completely. No stroke, no impression, just a faint rectangular shadow where names were never allowed to take shape. In the vestry cabinet of Kapil Ain, a slate-roofed parish that rests quietly between Landalo and Kimdu, there remains a weathered ledger titled Marwaithau, a Freodisa, spanning the years 1829 to 1885. The spine is broken at its midpoint. Several pages near the back are smeared and discolored where ink bled into water and time forming rust-colored rivers across once legible text. But the early pages, they are clean, sharp, full of order, names and ages, causes of death, marriages conducted by candlelight and in Latin, and burials recorded with a practiced hand, careful measured. Until 1842, that's when something quiet begins. A pattern only noticeable if you read slowly or twice. A pattern of disappearance, not of parents or spouses, but of children. Between 1842 and 1881, the parish recorded 18 marriages tied by proximity to the Gwyn property. 17 of them officiated by Reverend Daffyd Morgan, known locally for his compulsive neatness. His entries are surgical. Each letter balanced, each line evenly spaced. The grooms often bore the surname Rees. The brides varied. The witnesses blur. But what comes after these marriages is silence. No baptisms recorded, no marginal birth notations, no confirmations, no names for children reaching age. The vestry, so meticulous in tracking every sacramental step of parish life, seems to break its thread the moment a reunion is declared. It didn't go unnoticed. In 1877, a visiting curate from Breenshire scribbled a question into the margin of a sermon draft. Why no infants from the Reline? Who buries without record? His note was later struck through by another hand, a different ink lighter, the script more slanted. It read only, "Not our concern," yet someone was keeping record. Someone outside the church, a midwife, Mrs. Adarine Ree, unmarried. No confirmed blood relation to the family in question. But her 1865 delivery log, preserved today in the Carmore Women's Registry, tells a different story. 6 entries, all variations of the Rees name. Each notes a healthy delivery. Each logs an infant weight and records survival through first breath, but none are followed by a christening. None appear in the parish cradle rites. When questioned, Mrs. Ree simply said, "They do not request baptism, nor do they mourn." The profile we have of Mrs. Ree comes not from interviews, but from the margins of her own notebooks. And in those handwritten traces, something shifts. Earlier pages show confidence, neat, cursive, calm descriptions, temperature, skin tone, maternal reaction. But by 1870, her pen tightens. Her lines grow smaller. One entry reads, "Born with hands clenched. Would not open them for full hour. No cry." Another's eyes misaligned. Mouth moved, but without breath. They accepted him wordlessly. There are no medical alerts filed, no complaints lodged. Just one final page, smudged, dated with confusion. A single name blotted out beneath a streak of rust-colored ink. When the Capelline Parish Council was pressed in 1883 to explain the gap between the missing infant deaths and the surviving midwife records, their answer was brief. Baptism is voluntary. So too is grief. No further inquiry was made. And yet, something lingers in the pages that remain. 12 consecutive entries. No names, just perfect, evenly spaced lines, as if waiting for names that never came, or perhaps as some archivists whisper names that once were there, removed before the ink could dry. The letter was never meant for public eyes. Folded into thirds, sealed with dried wax, it arrived quietly at a Dean Street address in London during the autumn of 1879. It bore no return signature, just to Dr. H. Whittam Private. What lay inside wasn't a report. It was a confession, not of crime, but of confusion, a breach of clinical distance by a man trained to observe without fear. Dr. Arvell Lamb of Glen. G., a physician respected for his meticulous surgical notes and cold precision, had spent that year treating households scattered along the Kamatha coast. But in this letter, his writing shifts from medical to personal, uncertain. He describes a patient visit that, in his words, compromised professional certainty. The subject, a boy estimated to be between 14 and 17 years old. He had arrived at Dr. Lamb's practice just after sunset. Barefoot. A parcel of linen was bound tightly around his left forearm. The injury, according to the doctor's letter, was minor. A shallow laceration likely from fencing wire or the sharp edge of a slate tile. It had already been dressed clumsily but effectively, with an understanding of infection that hinted at experience. But it wasn't the wound that unsettled Dr. Arvell Lamb. It was the boy's words. When asked to name his guardian, the boy answered without hesitation, "My uncle who is my father, and my sister who bore me." Lamb pressed him for clarity. The boy repeated the phrase, "Exactly," then fell silent. When offered a mirror to view the bandage, he recoiled, visibly disturbed. Lamb's notes, still clinical at this point, record steady breath, symmetrical pupils, and several old scars, none of which aligned with typical farming accidents. But between the lines, something shifts. The formal language begins to falter. The boy gave no name. He refused both water and coin. He did not ask to be seen again. Later that night, Lamb attempted a sketch. He often drew his patients from memory in place of photographs. but each rendering felt wrong. Too smooth, too symmetrical, the jawline too perfect. Eventually, the face on the paper resembled not the boy, but a different patient. One of Lam's former patients. One who had died. Inside the envelope was a scrap of paper torn from an appointment log. In faint pencil, one sentence, he said they speak only in dates. There were no follow-up letters, no formal case filed with the Royal College. But years later, tucked into Dr. Whittam's private drawer, a single note surfaced. No signature. Dated November 12, 1879. Our will is changed. Something entered that boy and nested. I told him to leave it alone. But now he speaks of genetic echo. He says they don't need surnames anymore. No hospital in the region logged a teenage boy treated for a forearm wound that autumn. No death certificate matched the description. But in the 1879 Glengarthfield registry beneath refused treatment, one faint entry. No name. Same mouth as before. For 40 years, a narrow path pressed through bracken and stone behind Tiscod Edo, climbing a hill where no church stood. It led instead to a farmhouse with no curtains, no brass number, no scripture nailed to the lintel. The path wasn't on any map. Only one person used it, Mrs. Adarin Ree, the midwife of Kumdu and the outer ridgelines. She wasn't beloved, nor feared. Simply endured. Like something necessary, but difficult. In chapel, she sat in the back pew. Never knelt. Rarely spoke. But when she left a room, it always felt lighter. She delivered 73 children across 5 villages. But when asked in her later years how many were truly hers, she would glance east toward the Ree property and say, "I don't know if they counted." Her logbooks, partially preserved at the Kamathan Women's Health Archive, began neatly. Columns of names, birth times, weights, and positions. But over time, the clarity dissolved. In births tied to the Gwyn parcel, she stopped using Christian names. One entry from 1857 reads simply, farm birth. 5:12 a.m. Male. Pale crown, no cry. Umbilicus unusually high. Refused wrapping, no signature, no surname, no godparent. As years passed, her records warped. Blanks where weights should be. Vague phrases. Arms folded at birth. Did not reach. Third with identical left ear crease. Markings matched. She began measuring time in approximations. Light was dim. Approx. Date. And instead of naming mothers, she described presence. Or lack thereof. She did not weep, only watched. She nodded when it was time. In 1878 she wrote, "Asked for same blanket again." That line appears again. Twice more. As if she were returning the blanket not to a family, but to the same child. Modern psychologists who studied her writing posthumously saw signs of dissociation. Passive voice, missing details, a slow transition from ink to graphite, a retreat. Her final entry, dated November 1881, contains no words. Only a smudged square of charcoal, a print, or perhaps an attempt to erase something deeper than pigment. Her death certificate cited exhaustion of the heart, a term no longer used. She died at home. Alone. Months later, in a locked drawer, a cousin discovered a torn scrap of wool. Ink once hidden revealed itself under strong lamplight. A repeated sequence looped like a pattern. 1843 02.19, 1843 02.19, October 4.3.29. No child was officially born in the region that day. But according to the chapel's ledger, that was the year the Ree family first refused baptism. In 1874, a law quietly passed through the Welsh Office of Education. Its aim was simple on paper: ensure rural children living within 6 miles of a parish school were visited, named, and encouraged to attend. It was called Imviadu Goliuni, visits of light, on paper a kindness, in practice a test of the government's patience. Most officials returned with rosters, names, and vague promises to begin school after harvest. But one address never answered: Lot 42 Gwynfor. Only one man ever attempted the visit. He never went back. His name was David Runn, 22 years old, newly assigned to the Lando district. His personnel file, still preserved in the National Library of Wales, describes him as well-mannered, optimistic, and unfazed by bad weather. He carried no firearm, just a leather satchel with 3 blank forms, a red wax pencil, and a folding ruler. He left the village on May 19, 1874. He returned the next day, slower, paler. He submitted no paperwork. When asked why, he said, "I was not invited in, but I was not alone outside." The full report, submitted 2 days later, was calmer in tone but often slipped into something more elusive, almost poetic in its abstractions. It described a stone house tucked away and forgotten, its lower windows tightly boarded and the remaining panes stained on the inside with what looked like soot. The door, worn but clearly used, hung slightly ajar, yet would not move. Inspector Runn knocked 4 times. At the 4th knock, he stepped back. That's when he heard it. A sound, he wrote, not unlike children chanting. Yet the cadence was mechanical, steady, regulated like a metronome, as if rehearsed or remembered. Drawn by the eerie rhythm, he leaned toward the eastern wall of the house. And this, word for word, was what he claimed to hear. 1831 1104, 1836, 1104, 1841 1104, 1846 111, drove 4. The voices repeated these dates at exact 5-year intervals beginning in 1831. The numbers continued. No breath, no change in pitch. Just pure cold recitation. Runn pressed his ear against the stone. He noted the rhythm was perfectly unbroken. The voices weren't speaking Welsh or English, just numbers. And he was certain it came from within. He didn't knock again. When the district supervisor reviewed his report, he scribbled notes in the margins, openly skeptical. He accused Runn of letting fiction bleed into official records, calling his writing a dramatist's instinct poorly hidden behind civic duty. Runn wasn't fired, but within the month he was quietly transferred to a clerical role in Cardiff. He never returned to the field. What haunted him most, though he later confessed not publicly, but in a letter to his younger brother found decades later among estate papers, was not the sound. It was the math. The voices, if they were children, each spoke a year, spaced exactly 5 years apart. And 1831, that first date, he had traced in an old parish register. It was the year a schoolhouse once stood on that very site. A school shuttered due to what was described as abnormally delayed learning response. The final line of his letter ran up the page in a hurried vertical scroll. The years weren't lessons. They were names. Now here's where the trail leads us next, and I'd ask you to pay attention to the details. They're subtle, but they speak volumes. A thick, wool-bound ledger, wrapped in ash-inked leather, was kept for the agricultural tracts of Kamathan between 1835 and 1886. It catalogued livestock counts, grain yields, rainfall. The usual. Written plainly by parish clerks under pressure from London's auditors, the ledger prided itself on objectivity. Numbers, after all, do not lie. Or do they? Turn to page 219 of the 1848 volume and you'll find something peculiar. Lot 42, Gwynfor. 4 acres private ownership in use for 42 years. But across every yearly entry, not one harvest, not one bale of hay, not a single head of livestock recorded. Once or twice would have been normal. A bad year, disease, weather happens all the time. But every year, for over 4 decades, always the same notation, in the same handwriting, a long low dash in darker ink. And beside it, one word maintained. The first person to notice was Thomas Price, a registrar at the Yando office. His 1857 notes were typically dry, but this entry was different. Parcel 42 remains uncultivated, he wrote. Fences reinforced yearly. Soil turned. Gate replaced, always same wood. No carts, no laborers, no animals. He never formally pursued it. But in a personal letter to his cousin, a land surveyor in Radnashire, Price said the soil felt unnaturally fine, dull to the touch, as though sifted by mechanism, not hand. The rows, he added, were too perfect, like something a school child might be taught to trace for practice. But no children had ever been seen there, no adults either, just the work. By 1862, locals began calling it a ghost yield, a bureaucratic term for land kept just functional enough to avoid seizure, but producing nothing. The designation was meant for absentee landlords. But this wasn't absenteeism. It was presence without presence, maintenance without need. Clerks came to know it by a quieter name, the listening field. A place where the wind interfered with your pen and where ink took too long to dry. In 1870, under renewed scrutiny from London, a farming inspector named Idris Vaughan was dispatched to the site. His findings were minimal, just a brief, scentless note found years later among his belongings. Arrived 3:10 p.m. Soil turned. Rows present, no crop residue, no excrement. Ground does not compress under boot. Field resists. Sounds carry oddly. Trees nearby do not sway. He included no drawings, no maps, no follow-up. But something tells us he didn't forget. Oh, what would you have written if it had been you? If the field spoke back in numbers or refused to soften under your feet. Sleepy History Tales invites you to imagine not only what's recorded, but what was deliberately left out. We'll continue this strange journey soon. Let's keep going. The bottom edge of the report had been torn cleanly, but deliberately. On the following page of the registrar's master ledger, a clerk whose name was never logged attempted to list each land parcel by descending value. Most were recorded in tidy numerical order. But beside lot 42, the clerk wrote only, "Impossible to measure yield when seed is not known." Then, in a different, unfamiliar hand, came a single line scrawled beneath fence remains freshly painted. And finally, in that same strange script, an unsettling question. Who is it meant to keep out? On June 18, 1876, the Kamaria Board of Health initiated a sweeping rural sanitation audit, prompted by a string of dysentery outbreaks traced through the upper valleys. Curiously, none of the more isolated households were connected to the sickness. Nevertheless, compliance was compulsory. Every dwelling listed in the county's housing register would be inspected for outhouse drainage chimney soot and visible vermin. Most inspections lasted between 20 and 30 minutes. Only one lasted less than 10. That assignment fell to Inspector Ewan Combs, age 46, a former constable turned clerk with a pronounced aversion to confrontation. Known among his peers for episodes of nervous collapse when routines were disrupted. His ledger shows an unbroken service record, each page brimming with obsessively tidy, marginal notes. Percentages of waterline discoloration. Woodlouse counts even stitching quality of curtains. But for Lot 42, his log entry is the briefest in the entire register. Entry granted. 9 minutes. House does not conform to schema. Retired immediately. No further remarks. The page ends with a pale stain. Chalky, almost white, not ink. For years, no one questioned the brevity. That changed in 1902 during an archival consolidation effort when Combs's personal field diary was recovered. It had been sealed inside a weatherproof box labeled simply Margins. Inside on a page dated to the same inspection, another version of the visit emerged. At first, the handwriting was Combs's usual precise, small and evenly spaced. But by the 6th line, the pressure deepened. The letters shifted into angular forms as if his grip had tightened the structure, buckling under stress. Structure intact, he began. Door warped inward. Smell of uncut wool and tallow. Hallway narrow. Left side of house occluded. Windows shuttered from within and layered in tar paper. No visible hinges, no sound of animals or people. Further down the page, a sentence was underlined 3 times. Wall studs too close. Intervals of 4.5 inches. Impossible to walk through without brushing both shoulders. Still, he continued inward, deeper into what he called the living quadrant. There the notes collapsed into fragments. Clinical. Shaken, unnerved. No table. No beds. 6 chairs. Each facing a different corner. Black stains at the base of 3 walls. Not rising damp. Patterned. Spoke aloud. Voice did not return. Mirror did not show me. After that, the ink trails off. Combs exited without completing the required exterior checks. He walked back to town on foot, leaving behind his truncheon, a violation that drew a reprimand, but not a single question. He never spoke of Lot 42 again. Colleagues said he changed after that. He began refusing sunlight. He shrouded every window in his home with muslin, even through summer. His appetite withered. He seemed hollowed out by something unseen. Upon retiring 2 years later, Combs submitted an unsigned letter to the Inspector General. It was never filed, just misplaced among a stack of blank stationery. It held only 1 paragraph. It was not filth I found, no cruelty, no disease. It was shape without relation. Rooms built for movement, I do not know. I was welcome there, but only as reminder. They were no longer building for us. Spring 1880. A windstorm sheared shingles from the upper ridge of the Gwynford dwelling, revealing a patch of roof that had resisted repair for over a decade. Though the structure wasn't listed in any commercial registry, and the family had never contributed to county tax rolls, the parish vestry had allowed informal repairs if the fencing posed danger to livestock routes. That's how a local tradesman named F.N. Davies was quietly dispatched. No formal contract, no paperwork, just a verbal agreement and promise of barter. Davies was known for his silence, a worker of precision. He wore only one pair of boots marked time by hammer strokes and never spoke unless asked. His logbook passed down through his widow and eventually housed in the Yanelli Regional Archive records the job with just one line. Farmhouse at Edge. Slate realignment. 7 hours. No one home. But tucked in the back pocket of that book was a separate folded slip of lined paper. Not part of the log. Written in haste. It described what he found when a portion of ceiling gave way. Under plank, sanded over, but still shallowed. And so we ask friends, what was it that lived in the angles between walls at Lot 42? What does it mean when a home no longer welcomes us, but tolerates our presence only to remember a different kind of builder? If you've made it this far, you're one of us now. Let's continue. 3 dates carved in what could only be described as a child's hand, each one etched into the wood with unsettling care. The same day, March 17th, but across 3 different years, 1872, 1867, and 1862. One date was carved upside down. There were no names, just numbers so faint they seemed less meant to be read than remembered, like a whisper made into matter. Davis tried chalking over them to bring the impressions into relief, but the powder refused to cling. Instead, the wood grain itself shifted when caught by angled light, subtle bends and curves, as if the numbers had been scratched into living timber, not dead lumber. The rhythm of the dates' 5-year intervals, always the same day, suggested not genealogy but return, a recurrence without reference. But it was a line beneath the last date that most disturbed Davies, words barely visible, perhaps imagined, but written down in his notebook all the same. We are not born, only continued. He said nothing to the homeowners. Never met their eyes again. He finished the roof accepted payment in tallow and salt and walked home in silence. That night, Davies burned the trousers he'd worn to the job, blaming a smell he could not identify and a brittle dryness in the seams that hadn't been there that morning. When asked years later why he'd stopped taking hill work, his reply came quick and flat. Some families plant downward. He never explained. The boards he replaced have never been opened again. But in 1976, during a brief academic survey on regional carpentry in Carmarthenshire, a student from Bangor University made a curious note in a report that was never published but still resides in a departmental drawer. Next to a diagram of the house's northeast bedroom joist, she penciled a simple observation. One board rings differently, almost hollow beneath its warmth. Far from there, deep in the vestry archive at Langadog, beneath a collapsed shelf labeled Marriages, Mixed Parishioners, lies a fragile half-molded registry. Its ink is bled, its paper brittle, but across towns and decades, a single pattern survives. 5 names: Miriam Bethan, Alfred Ayanto, and Lowry recur over and over. They appear in birth ledgers, vanish, then resurface. Always attached to the same stretch of land, always shifting counties, and always written in slightly altered hand. The anomaly was not found by a historian but by Ellis T. Rowan, a coal surveyor in 1892. tracing hereditary mineral rights. He expected surnames. Instead, he found first names curling back on themselves like old rope. One child, Alfred Ree, was born in 1833. Then again younger by 2 years in 1858, baptized in another parish. No death listed between. The writing on both entries was nearly identical, but the attending reverends were not. Another entry dated 1864 records a Lowry Rees born at morning to the Eastern Ridge. The exact phrase appears again in 1869 to the same mother. No death, no correction. Rowan sent a memo to the local clerk's office. Names recur in perfect rotation, sequences unbroken for over 60 years. If deaths occurred, they were not recorded. If births were false, they were not questioned. The implication was left unstated but unmistakable. Either the names were being reused deliberately, or no one had ever truly left. Efforts to untangle the pattern only deepened the strangeness. In 1871, a census reviewer in Carmen tried cross-referencing school rosters with baptismal records. The result was a chart, 5 names, repeated in differing orders across 17 households. In the margins, the inspector scribbled in pencil, Yanu is listed as both father and son in 2 entries, separated by 21 years. All names in the same hand. No middle names used. Graphology wasn't yet formalized, but informal analysis by Clark's College noted consistency, especially the R in Ree, which always dipped at the midpoint before rising again. One archivist described it as a descending hesitation. The ministers behind the records varied in temperament, but one Reverend Gareth T. Elwin of Yandere resigned abruptly in 1873 after being asked to clarify certain discrepancies. His final sermon survives only in fragments, but one sentence would later be cited in Parliament. What is born again and again cannot be blessed twice. When questioned, he refused to elaborate. His wife later told a local paper that he'd begun whispering the 5 names in his sleep, each with identical tone and cadence, as if fulfilling a ritual, not recalling a memory. The Ree family's records were later pulled from the main archive and placed in a drawer labeled Non-Sequentials. It remains locked. The final slip of paper inside reads, all 5 accounted for. None confirmed buried. The only known photograph was catalogued in 1891 by the Carmen Preservation Society, part of a broader effort to document vernacular Welsh architecture before the railway boom. At first glance, the photograph seems unremarkable. A wall lime-plastered stone darkened by soot, its surface streaked with faint, vertical watermarks. A simple wooden chair, spindle-backed and empty, rests beneath a shuttered window. Quiet. Still. But above the chair, shallowly carved into the plaster, are 5 names, etched in staggered columns, some faint, others deep. No dates, no surnames, no order. Just Bethan Mirren, Alfred Lowry, and Yanto. The image was taken by an amateur antiquarian, Horace B. Edis, who noted the scene for its peculiar restraint. In his field book, he suggested the names were likely decorative, a humble folk record of lineage. He fixed the original print to a linen card and filed it in room 3C drawer 4 domestic, east walls. 6 months later, another photograph was submitted under the same address. This one came from Miss Saris Wynne, a junior archivist assigned to document structural warping in homes supported by slate. She was instructed to re-photograph the exact same parlor wall from the exact same angle, and she did. The frame is nearly identical. The chair remains beneath the window. The same streaks of soot run down the plaster. The scratchings are in the same place, etched at the same height, but the names are different. In this second image, the wall reads Maridoyangau Anwen and Alfred. Only Alfred remains. The rest are gone, overwritten, replaced. Or perhaps never there at all. Miss Wynne spotted the discrepancy while comparing proofs for her archive index cards. She double-checked the file numbers. She verified the house, the coordinates, the angle. When she brought it to her supervisor, she was told the plaster must have been resurfaced between visits. Yet, in a private letter to a friend, she wrote something else. She had touched the wall, she said. Ran her fingers along the etchings. The plaster was dry, cracked in exactly the same places as in the first photograph. No dust, no fresh lime, no sign of recent work, just an unmistakable warmth behind the stone. In 1892, the Preservation Committee reviewed both photographs. The paper was authentic. Camera models matched, exposure angles aligned. And yet, the second image was labeled a possible retake error. A note in pencil was added beside it, discard if unnecessary. But it was not discarded. Instead, both prints were relocated to a locked drawer in the archive annex, reserved for anomalies not considered fraudulent, yet not explainable. On the outer flap, written in red grease pencil, someone had scrawled a sentence, compare only in stillness. The difference resists being shown aloud. No further photos of the parlor wall were ever taken. But nearly 40 years later, in 1931, during a renovation of the Gwynn property, a contractor sent a postcard to the Kamadansa archive. On it, he wrote, "We were told to preserve the interior as is, but there's nothing there. Just scratches that don't stay put. I chalked one for tracing, turned around, and the chalk was gone." In October of 1882, a handwritten note was delivered to the home of Dr. Idris Levin, the only physician serving the northernmost part of Kamadhan. The note arrived not by courier, not by parish official, but folded into the coat pocket of a silent boy who gave no name. He stood at the threshold unmoving until the doctor's housekeeper retrieved the letter. The note, still preserved in the doctor's private files, contained no greeting, no sender. It read, "Please assess the boy. He does not sleep. He has begun counting through walls." The location given was known, informally referred to as Gwynn, officially listed as Lot 42G. The doctor had never been there. He had never planned to go. He, like many, had heard enough. But the letter's tone, so calm, so clinical, troubled him. 2 days later, he made the walk, alone. What followed was never recorded in any formal medical file. No patient chart, no bill. Just a note in the margins of his appointment book, nestled between cancelled consultations and a missed shipment of quinine. Boy appeared at door before I knocked. Eyes clear, lower jaw identical to prior two siblings. Chin notch deepened. Dimple perfectly symmetrical. Did not speak. Traced a square in dust, then halved it 3 times. Dr. Levin did not step inside. He would later admit, under pressure from the vestry, that he refused to enter the home. Not out of fear, he claimed, but because I had already seen what I came to find. Not in one face, in all of them. The boy showed no signs of illness, no fever, no bruises, no frailty. But his jaw was unmistakable. A bifid formation in the mental bone, coupled with a bilateral muscular symmetry, So rare it had appeared only once in 19th century medical literature, and only as a theoretical sketch. The doctor described it as a mouth drawn twice on the same bone. What unsettled him was not the rarity of the trait, but its perfect repetition. 3 siblings had been treated at the Yandelo dispensary in past years: an abscess, a broken wrist, intestinal parasites. Dr. Levin had dismissed their resemblance as familial. Now he knew better. It was not similarity. It was sameness. Less than 6 months later, he resigned from his post, citing exhaustion. He moved inland, took no more patients. He lived out his years quietly cataloguing wildflowers. In one of his final notebooks, kept not with medical records, but tucked among pressed ferns, he had written again and again across 3 pages. The jaw remembers, even when the child forgets. Beneath the final line in the ledger, someone, likely a patient or perhaps a visiting relative, had added a faint scrawl. Ink thinned with time and hesitation. It read, "We only needed one of us to last." In the deep winter of 1890, a quiet inspection was ordered at the old Gwyn farmhouse. Weeks of unrelenting rain had weakened the slope behind the house, and part of the earth had given way. A retaining wall collapsed. What they thought was just runoff erosion soon revealed something stranger: a small cavity tucked behind the base of the kitchen hearth. At first glance, it seemed a mundane flaw in the stonework, perhaps a collapsed drain pocket. Nothing more. The builders were sent merely to stabilize the foundation. But as they worked, one of them dislodged a panel, a slab of horsehair plaster expertly concealed, and behind it, something no blueprint recorded. Something no one, not even the aging mason who'd once restored the roof, could remember. A room, 6 feet across, with no flooring, no fixtures, no door. Just the ragged hole they'd made through the hearth. The air inside was dry. Still, it carried the faint scent of scorched wool and lime, the kind of scent you don't smell until it's already clinging to your clothes. And then the silence broke not with sound, but with sight. From floor to ceiling, all 4 walls were blackened in graphite. Some areas thick, others faded, but everywhere the pressure of the hand remained visible. Etched strokes that had somehow resisted time, sharper than soot, deeper than dust. And within that blackened veil, dates. Always 2 numbers separated by a dash. Rows of them. Birth and death years. Some clear spans. Others repeated the same number twice. Still others ended abruptly, just a single date and nothing more. Some had been scraped over and redrawn, leaving ghost trails like shadows trying to escape erasure. But what struck the workers most wasn't the content of the dates. It was their arrangement. They weren't chronological. They weren't random either. They curved. They flowed in columns that arced as though orbiting an invisible center. Some trailed upward toward the ceiling corners. Others bent downward, wrapping into the base of the wall. The implication chilled them. It was as if the dates were designed to enshrine something that had once stood there. An absence with a shape. The builders were told to reseal the space. But before they did, a journeyman mason named Silas Murrig copied down a few of the pairings into his ledger. His record, now partially torn, still survives in the West Kancher Masonry Union archives. It shows 5 full entries: 1812, 1837, 1837, 1842, 1847, 1852, 1852 repeated. Each entry bore a blank line beneath it, faintly penciled in. Space for a name that was never added. Morig later wrote a private letter to his cousin, claiming these weren't lifespans. They were attempts, failures. Marks, he wrote, they were trying to hold still. He never returned to the site, declined further pay, claimed a rash had appeared beneath his fingernails that same night. A dryness, he called it, that clung, that would not wash out. No candle soot was found. No signs of bedding tools or life. Just the graphite, just the dates. And in one corner, a folded square of raw wool. When touched, it crumbled into nothing. Before resealing the room, the appointed archivist recorded one final inscription, faint, nearly invisible, without lamplight. Named in turn, named in era. We corrected it here along the sloped paths of Siskodi Bedau. Let that one sit with you. You see, in the village, records those dusty ledgers filled with births and blessings, hymns and misdeeds. There's a curious absence. No Reese voice was ever remembered in wind or chapel hymn. Not in playground scuffles, not even in the steady murmur of market gossip, where even a sneeze might travel with a surname. And yet, the Ree family existed. They were known. Their land was marked, their footfalls accounted for, their births recorded, but their voices only ever seen, never heard. Grocers in the hamlet of Flanders kept shallow boxes under their counters just wide enough to hold folded notes. They came from the Gwyn farmhouse. No one from the Ree family entered the shops. They never collected packages in person. Children too young to be interrogated delivered their messages. Or in one eerie case, a gloved hand extended from a passing cart and silently laid an envelope on the edge of a weighing scale. Every note bore the same writing. Precise, tilted, inhumanly neat, and always unnervingly short. 5 measures flour, no salt, no glass. Send wool uncut. We finish here. Never names, never thanks. Only one signature. Us. The earliest known trace of this peculiar signature appeared in the parish merchant ledger of 1849. A tinsmith by the name of Gethin Pugh recorded an unusual message exchanged in lieu of payment for a small handful of roofing nails. He made special note of its phrasing, which struck him as odd, even poetic. Gethin sent the note to his brother, a schoolteacher in Lanera, who wrote back with a chilling observation, who signs as a crowd but lives as a fold. This is not poor grammar, it's a refusal. Decades later, the handwriting was reviewed by a linguistics researcher from Aberystwyth. What they found was troubling. There was no sign of aging, no tremble from arthritis, no naive loops of childhood, no stylistic evolution over 4 decades. Just perfect mechanical consistency, identical spacing, identical pressure, identical slant, as if written by a hand that never changed or by something that never aged at all. Now if you're still with me, stay close, because things begin to darken here. A local constable named Idris Mabun once attempted to trace the origin of the messages. His logbook contains a curious entry. He stationed himself behind the slate works at Luin Bedu and kept watch on the road for 3 days straight. And on the 3rd morning, he saw him, a boy no more than 10 years old, quietly place a folded slip of paper at the apothecary's window. Mabun followed, at a safe distance at first. The child moved silently behind a row of holly trees, and then quite suddenly was gone. Vanished, no sound, no prints in the dew. Just the note waiting where he had stopped. It read in the same narrow, meticulous hand. Need blue tincture for the mouth, quiet preferred us. The constable underlined for the mouth in his private copy of the report. He never formally submitted the entry. On the back page of the logbook, a margin note appears in his handwriting. They write together or they are written by one. I cannot decide which disturbs me more. That would not be the last appearance of the signature, nor the most unsettling. In 1894, a butcher in the nearby village of Capitalis received a folded request, a lamb shoulder bone, removed clean with a peculiar note appended. No wrapping. We do not wish to crinkle. When the delivery boy returned with the parcel undisturbed, a second note had appeared, tucked precisely under the twine. We do not like noise. We erase what echoes. Now, if you're the sort who believes that paper cannot whisper or that ink cannot remember, I'd gently ask you to reconsider. Among the many documents lost in the mergers and closures of late-century Welsh institutions, few have left such an enduring echo as Medical Report 42R, dated July 1884. It was authored by a certain Dr. Alric Tolbert, who had been contracted temporarily to the Carden Parish Infirmary. The report itself does not survive, but its shadow lingers. It is referenced faintly twice, once in a redacted appendix of a Ministry of Health audit 4 years later. That audit bore a curious stamp, reviewed, not to be reissued. A sealed column contains a terse summary line. Case 42R involved theoretical diagnosis based on third-party testimony. No clinical contact confirmed. Strange, very strange, because Dr. Tolbert was known for his precise, cautious style. He never speculated without prolonged in-person observation. And yet, the language attributed to him in the audit margin reads more like a man describing something seen through a veil and glimpsed too long. Observed symptoms include secondary morphological decay, particularly of cartilage ligament cohesion, cranial asymmetry with posterior flattening, and a phenotype repetition rate inconsistent with biological variance. Speech patterns described as mechanically harmonized. Secondary morphological decay, a term never before recorded in British medical literature, appears to be Tolbert's own invention. Its meaning, unclear. But its context suggests a concept beyond disease. Something recursive, something echoing, not illness, but a kind of structural fatigue passed from one body to the next. Each copy weaker, each repetition duller, until what stood before him, or so he imagined, was not a child, but the echo of one. More disturbing still, Tolbert, by every surviving record, never examined these children in person. All notes were submitted by third parties, a midwife, most likely Mrs. Adarinri, an unnamed constable, a school inspector who visited Lot 42 but never crossed the threshold. Tolbert's only visit to Kamarancha had been 2 years prior for a lecture on bone mineral density. His medical files for 1884 list no patient visits outside of London, and yet somehow his report included data that could only be gathered through direct examination. Precise cranial measurements, curvature of the dental arch thresholds for motor response. One line allegedly quoted, verbatim continues to unsettle. Jaw hinge shows no degradation despite age ambiguity. Mandibular structure appears preserved through sequence memory. Identity may be anchored structurally, rather than psychologically. There has never been an explanation for how he could have known the things he did. Tucked away in the disordered files of the Royal College of Surgeons lies a private letter dated late 1884. In it, Dr. Tolber writes to a colleague with trembling restraint, "If they never die, it is not due to resilience. It is because they are not fully new. A partial organism, repeated too long, forgets how to break. These are not children. They are recollections wearing meat." He never published again. In 1885, Tolbert resigned from practice without public notice and disappeared to the Isle of Anglesey. He refused all correspondence. When he passed in 1911, a public trustee was sent to clear his modest stone cottage. Among the few personal effects, a small wooden drawer, a bone caliper, a burned file tag marked 42R, and a scrap of folded paper with a single word typed in block capitals. Enough. In the spring of 1883, the Carmen Education Office sent out its final round of rural inspectors to enforce compliance with the Elementary Education Act. These agents, unpaid, overworked, and often drawn from the lower clerical classes, were tasked with recording attendance, verifying claims of home instruction, and ensuring every household was at the very least accounted for. Inspector Howell Emes was among them. He was 52. Quiet. Known for stiff joints and a peculiar preference for graphite over ink. Ink, he claimed, settles too permanently. He'd spent 6 years winding through ridgelines and glens. His field diaries remain some of the most oddly detailed fence measurements, child posture, and even notations on the weight of bread loaves left cooling on windowsills. But the final entry in his 1883 log stands apart. Dated June 3rd. No heading, no location, just this. No response, no sound. The glass was warm to the touch, though it faced the eastern field. This entry does not appear in the official register. It exists only in the personal copy retrieved from Emes's satchel 3 days after he failed to return to the vestry. The house he visited that day is assumed to be Lot 42 GIF, though the text never says so outright. Water damage obscures the coordinates in the margin, but several surviving digits correspond with the mapped boundary of the Rees property. Here's what is known. No inspector was ever sent there again. Emes's coat was found, later draped neatly over a split stone wall 1 mile south of the suspected property. His field forms were intact, unsigned. His compass was gone. No search party was sent. No inquiries made. A confidential memo addressed to the county superintendent and since redacted was rediscovered in a bundle of unfiled school reports. One line references Emes. EM's final notation does not conform to expected inspection phrasing. No follow-up recommended. Mark as entered but unmeasurable. Whether entered refers to the property or the ledger has never been clarified. Subsequent copies of the logbook were quietly altered. The final page remains numbered but blank. Only a faint outline from a long-removed paperclip remains. The vestry clerk who later transcribed the year's entries included a handwritten marginal note. Nothing to transcribe. Howell's last page behaved oddly under lamplight. Incline floats. Does not sit. No forensic inquiry, no disappearance report. His personal effects were mailed to distant relatives in Swansea. But the logbook? It was sealed not out of reverence but out of caution. It did not feel like something to be discarded. Then 30 years later, 1913. During the early construction of a rail spur on the eastern slope once mapped by MS, a station worker named Kawin Idris reported something odd. He found a graphite pencil brittle and upright embedded in a length of stone. Near the grip, faint blade-scratched initials H. The field where it was found faced east. There is no structure there now. But in late June, when the wind moves through the tall grass, there's a faint sound, a slow rhythmic tapping like fingers brushing glass. By 1891, the old Gwynfor farmhouse had begun to collapse beneath its own silence. No tax had been paid in over 30 years. No birth or death recorded since the prior census. No known living heirs. And so, without announcement, the Carmarthenshire Parish Council authorized its quiet demolition. The order to dismantle the old structure didn't pass through public channels. There was no hearing, no council signature. It came quietly, just a side note scrawled in the margins of a building inspector's ledger. Unclaimed structure, hazard to livestock. Strip internal wood for reuse. 3 men were sent non-local. No one from the village volunteered. The lead was a tradesman from Cardiff, a man named Berwin Lewis, known in salvage circles for his speed and silence. He arrived with 2 hired hands and a folding saw. The task was simple: recover usable timber from the kitchen and the western sitting room. But the house, as you might expect, had other intentions. In the western wall behind plaster that looked suspiciously too smooth, curved just enough to catch the light wrong, they found a panel. Not nailed, but riveted. Hand-forged. The wood grain ran against the rest of the structure, horizontal, not vertical, suggesting it was never part of the original frame. A later addition, or an insertion. When they finally pried it open, the smell came first. Dry metal, cold rust. Then a faint, heatless rise like old coins in a locked drawer. The last rivet gave way with a brittle snap, and from the cavity poured not air, not dust, but a rain of black flakes. Thousands of them, pouring like grain from a broken sack. They didn't fall so much as descend, purposefully, a dark cascade. It wasn't ash, it wasn't paper. It stuck to everything skin collar's wrists and didn't smudge. It settled, and it stayed. Only when they looked closer did the men realize the flakes bore markings, letters, even full names. Thick black ink on parchment shards, some curled from age, others impossibly flat, and some hauntingly looked like they'd been peeled from the wall itself. The ink had cracked over time into plates, and as it fell, names emerged, overlapping, repeating. Lowry, Alfred, Miriam, familiar to some, unknowing to others. The names weren't arranged like a list, but a spiral, a labyrinth of echoes. Some were written backward, some mirrored atop others. Some had no orientation at all, no dates, no surnames. And yet, within moments of air exposure, the flakes began to crumble. Not into dust, but into pigment, sinking into skin, becoming it. Berwin Lewis later claimed that no amount of scrubbing could remove the stains. For 3 days, he said, the names Anto and Bethan remained in the lines of his palms. Neither man remembered seeing those names at the scene. Neither believed they had touched those flakes directly. One of the boys, Lou Thomas, returned the next morning to fetch a misplaced wrench. He found the wall changed. It no longer shed ink. It bled it. Thin vertical threads of black seeped from the engraved names, as though the ink were being rewritten from within. But the surface remained dry. No dampness. No drip. Just a slow weeping. A single flake saved by instinct or dread was preserved in a folded cloth and given to the parish registrar. Today it sits in an unlabeled archival envelope, sealed, untested. The envelope bears no date, no signature, just a short note in pencil added by an unknown clerk. Do not open again. It knows handwriting. Now hold that image for just a moment, because in 1922, the Ministry of Health authorized a sweeping inquiry across the rural Welsh uplands. Its aim: to investigate inherited deformities under the increasingly scrutinized lens of eugenic hygiene. An uncomfortable phrase today, but one still taken seriously at the time. They called it the Carmarthenshire Hereditary Condition Survey. Leading the effort was Dr. Alistair Meacham, a rising star in genetic pathology, a methodical man. He had spent 5 years along the Devon coast, measuring jawlines, cataloguing oddities of the skull, and noting limb fusions with the cold precision of a taxonomist. Some said he could calculate a cousinship from a forehead wrinkle. And yet somehow, Lot 42 eluded him. The Gwynfor parcel appears in his planning documents not once but twice. First in a short list labelled Known Anomalies per Parish Ledger, and again in the final review where it struck through in thick black ink. No reason, no initials, just a heavy line, a gap, silence. And here's what makes that strange. Every neighboring parcel was examined in excruciating detail. Cranium x-rays, jaw measurements, even family portraits fastened in folios with brass pins. But the land, known to have housed the Rees line 3 generations deep, was skipped entirely. The only surviving mention of this exclusion comes in a ministry memo dated March 17, 1923. Its label: confidential, departmental use only. Gwyn family excluded from survey under category silence per prior protocol. Records sealed. No correspondence to follow. The phrase category silence appears nowhere in public record. It's not mentioned in the scientific literature of the period, nor does it align with any known ministry classification. And yet, over the next decade, the phrasing begins to resurface sporadically, quietly in rural district reports that at first glance seem entirely unrelated. Each time it's found adjacent to properties marked by strange disruptions, broken family trees with no clear origin burial registers that don't reconcile, or what one inspector chillingly described as ancestral recursion without historical mechanism. When questioned years later by a university colleague, Dr. Edwin Mycomb, who led the original Carmarthen survey, allegedly admitted off record to having once reviewed anatomical sketches said to be drawn by the Rhea children. He described the illustrations as impossible to chart, symmetric in repetition, not in form. There were features I had measured before, he said, but never in combination. The jawline didn't just repeat, it resumed. He refused to elaborate further. A private field note found in one of Meekum's later journals contains only a single line. The child was not the son. He was the continuation. Meacham withdrew from academic research in 1923 and died quietly in 1944. The remaining materials from the Carmarthen study were deposited into an annex of the Royal Anthropological Society, where they gathered dust unopened for nearly 70 years. When a graduate researcher finally requested access to the file marked Rees Line 42G, they were told the folder had been pulled for reclassification. No return date was listed. On the now empty file tab, faint and nearly erased, someone had written in pencil line, ongoing. Do not interrupt. In the final weeks of 1936, as Britain braced for the rise of a new monarch and the world leaned unsteadily toward another war, a quieter change occurred, buried deep in the back corridors of the Ministry of Health. It wasn't a policy revision, nor a medical advisory. It was a memo, undated, unsigned, tucked in a plain manila folder marked in charcoal pencil hold. Not for public release, the document inside bore no address, no official header. But the watermark matched that of the ministry's epidemiological advisory stationery, used between 1928 and 1935. Its message was brief. Effective immediately, all reference to Case 1883 is to be removed from academic compilations, district census ledgers, and medical abstracts. The case is closed in spirit and in statute. Further citation is to be interpreted as error, not omission. There were no footnotes, no justification. Just a handwritten marginal note, likely added later by a confused clerk. No names given, no bodies filed, no consent ever located. Category unfit for preservation. Curiously, Case 1883 had never been formally named in public before that memo. The designation had existed only in fragments. A field report from the Rural Sanitation Bureau that had gone missing for over a decade, an abandoned genetic study proposal, a survey ledger from Cairnshire. What remained of it was quietly relocated to a restricted section of the National Record Office, indexed under a single classification not found. Researchers who attempted to retrieve any portion of the case after 1936 received a uniform reply, material retained for internal review. Not catalogued. One such researcher, Dr. Clive Morant, tracing inherited traits in West Wales, stumbled across a brief mention of the case in the private notebook of a retired field pathologist. The pathologist, who had never published under his own name, had written the same line across 3 separate pages. No children born there. Only continued. Morant's appeals for further access were denied officially for archival integrity preservation. According to declassified meeting minutes from the Access Board in 2001, one panelist remarked, "Whatever happened in 1883 does not appear to have concluded, and we do not yet have policies for the unending." The original 1936 letter was formally destroyed during a 1948 departmental restructuring. Only a single carbon copy remained misfiled in an envelope marked obsolete citations. It was shelved without a barcode, without any accession tag. In the lower right-hand corner of that envelope, visible only when held at an angle in light, a faded pencil note appears. It's not typed, it's not stamped, and no official has ever claimed to have written it. Some families outlast paper. In 1954, a team of independent genealogists from the University of Bangor launched a modest archival project in Carmarthenshire. Their goal was simple: rebuild family trees broken by poverty, plague, or emigration. Restore lost names, close the circle, and they succeeded, for the most part. But in one lineage, they found something else, something the records did not lack, but overflowed with. A line that had no missing branches, no known origin, and more unsettlingly, no end. The Ree family of Lot. 42. if they were ever truly reappeared in more than a dozen registries spanning 70 years. And yet, no single document ever traced a full lineage. Instead of branching outward into siblings, cousins, or distant kin, the data seemed to fold inward. The same 5 forenames appeared again and again: Lowry, Marion, Alfred, Bethan, Ianto. No consistent surnames, no reliable aging, and not one of them died with proper documentation. In the parish ledgers, they surfaced first as infants. Later, they reappeared as witnesses. And then decades on, they emerged once more as parents to one another. A girl named Bethan was recorded as born in 1842, married in 1863, and then baptized again in 1884. No cause given, no questions asked. A man named Marion signed a land lease in 1855. That exact same signature, same curling M, same heavy final N, later appeared on a school application from 1891. His age oddly was listed as 10. One member of the genealogical team, a student researcher named Gwen Priest, tried to diagram the lineage on a board. Her initial design was simple, just 5 points on a family route. But the more data she added, the more the lines began to reverse. A daughter became her own mother. A groom signed beneath the name he once listed as his father. After 12 hours, the diagram was no longer a tree at all. It was a wheel. 5 names orbiting a center, with no beginning and no end. Gwen's margin notes became increasingly disjointed in the days that followed. She began referencing lineal recursion, non-sequential kinship, and then over and over a single phrase: "They are not ancestors, they are continuations." She left the project soon after, and left academia for good the following year. The lead archivist, Dr. Huell James, attempted to contact families in neighboring properties. Most homes had been abandoned. A few offered vague recollections, mention of quiet folk who kept to themselves, children who never seemed to change size, and parcels left on doorsteps wrapped in wool tied in twine, stitched with only a number. One elderly woman living just 2 miles east of the old Gwyn boundary recalled playing with a girl who said her name was whatever the wind remembered that day. When asked if she could recall the girl's face, the woman paused, then answered slowly, "I think she was 3 people. Not all at once, but not quite apart either." The final genealogical chart was never published. It rests in storage untitled, a sprawl of black thread mounted on linen board. Its lines intersect and curl back again and again. No branches, no roots, just a closed loop. Names drawn into themselves. On the back of that frame, beneath old wax, a message is scratched in faint graphite. This is not a family. It is a shape. In May of 1971, a preservationist named Reese Fletcher was assigned to survey 10 rural properties in Kamata. Collapsed barns, flooded cellars, and one long-abandoned structure, Lot 42 Upper Gwynfor. He left Landovery with a camera, a notebook, and no expectation of finding more than rotted beams and wind-worn stone. But the house stood exactly where the 1892 topographic map said it would. And stranger still, it stood intact. The roof hadn't entirely failed, the door still upright though sunken in the earth. The windows sealed tight, smeared with age. And yet, inside it didn't feel empty. It felt paused. Fletcher's field notes described the air as unnaturally still. Dust didn't shift when he walked. It held shape, like fine sediment in undisturbed water. His tone was curious, not alarmed. He chalked the beams, took photographs, and spent the longest stretch at the hearth. A short stone fireplace, its lintel mortared sometime in the last century. At the base, etched faintly into the stone, he found a date, 1971 Dozorfov, 9. The very day of his visit. He touched it. It wasn't chalk, not soot, not weathered graffiti. The numbers had been carved, not aged or eroded, but newly, cleanly, with precision. The chisel marks were fresh, the lines sharp. When photographed, the date appeared darker, not due to pigment, but contrast, as though the hearthstone had been waiting for the mark to appear. Fletcher was alone that day. No one entered before him. The site had not been maintained since the demolition order of 1921, an order that was never carried out. And yet, in a home untouched for 50 years, the carving appeared sometime between his arrival and his final sweep. He never reported it to the agency. Only a private notebook, later donated to the University of Aberystwyth, records the moment. On its final page, he wrote, "I retraced my steps 3 times. No fresh boot prints, no movement in the ash. But the scratch was warm, like a name made while watching." 1 year later, Fletcher collapsed suddenly during a museum tour in Swansea. According to a colleague, his last words were soft. Almost puzzled, they're still keeping track. The hearthstone was removed in 1983 during a brief excavation. The date was gone, but the incision lines remained. Beneath them, the stone showed signs of internal folding stratification, as if it had once been pried open and then sealed again before the dust could rise. No living record of the Ree family exists beyond 1895. No photographs, no graves, no wills, only ink that won't dry, names that don't age, and dates that echo behind sealed doors. To this day, the parcel remains unclaimed, and every attempt to erase it, whether from census map or archive, has ended the same way, with those 5 names reappearing somewhere new. So the question isn't whether they existed, it's whether they ever stopped. And now that you've heard this far, I have a question for you. What's the last name you saw today? And how many times have you heard it before? Subscribe to the 7th mark. There are more names waiting, more doors they never meant to open, and more stories that were never meant to be told.